Hi, Tim Vandersloos here. You know, every art form has its own unique quirks and little things that are a little bit different from other types of artwork. Now, power carving is much the same way in a sense. And even though traditional knives and gouges, we can create the same similar textures, with power, it's a whole lot easier to create. So what I want to do in this video is show you one of the really good general purpose useful textures that we can create with power carving tools to help us differentiate between elements of our scene or other elements within the carving. Now, why is that important? Well, if we were using paint, we could just pick a different color, pick a different shade of the same color, and apply it in such a way that we can differentiate between different elements. But when we're not using color, and we're not using stain, and all we're using is the depth of the carving, the levels and the layers, or perhaps, you know, texture to define the different elements of our carving, we have to have a repertoire of different textures that we're familiar with that we can kind of, you know, pull out of the hat and just use to be able to say, okay, this is a tree, this is the shrub next to the tree, this is a little bit deeper, farther back, there's a mountain right there, and how does that look? Or, you know, whatever the scene may be, there's different elements. Even on a flower, the petal or the stem or the stamen's going to be different, or the leaves. All these different elements just of a flower change, and we need to differentiate with them between the other elements. Otherwise, we're just going to lose the depth and the detail of what it is we've carved. So in this video, let's switch over here, and I'm going to show you how to use a combination of two round burrs to come up with multiple different textures using the same burrs. So let's get started. Alright, so I don't have fancy names for these different kinds of textures, but let's go ahead and work on this one. What it is a combination of small stipple and large stipple. And there's so many different variations. Maybe I'll do some of these at different spaces just to show you what it can look like depending on how you do it. Now, I'm going to tack this first by using a number 10 carbide round, number 9 carbide round to do the small stipple, and then I'll come back with a number 10 carbide round to do the large stipple, and it's just a matter of interweaving it into something that you like. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a shot. As you'll see throughout this video, there are a great many things that we can create by using the foundation of the stipple. Based on how we go about spacing out each of the stipples, the size of the burr that we use, the depth that we go with that burr, and how tight we make each one of the stipple marks really changes and greatly influences what the look of the finished texture is. Using this texture as a starting point to show you how these two burrs can be used in combination, you'll see that there are a lot of different textures that can be created to help distinguish individual elements of your carving. Since we are using shape and form more than color to define each element of our carvings, having a good repertoire of textures will greatly benefit your overall look of the finished carving. Okay, so here we go with the number 10 carbide. Alright, so on this section I did go quite a bit deeper than I would normally go with some stipples. This was to create that more creviced out, that really I don't know, highly textured crevice look that you might find on coral reef or some kind of rocks. Alright, it just has a lot of deep texture to it. Now I did the small carbide round first because I wanted to kind of lay in the gaps and make sure I didn't fill the whole thing up with the large carbide round. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move over to this section here, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. This time I'm going to start with the large carbide and establish the basic flow. I'm not going to go as deep, and then I'm going to come back again with the number 9 carbide round to add some more detail.
Now I really like the basic stipple that I can get by using one burr and just doing a tight random pattern. And that is just plain and simple and easy. And you can change the effect of the stipple by the size of the burr that you use. But when you've got a scene where perhaps you have a dozen different elements that you need to represent and distinguish one from another, especially when they're close or crossing or laying on one on top of each of the other, you really have to come up with new ways to use your textures and create textures that will help distinguish the elements. And that's the most important part about this whole section of texturing videos, is to give you ideas of how to create those differentiations. Now with this particular texture, it's random on top of random using 2 different sizes of burrs. Anytime that's done, you're going to get something that looks different. Now depending on the sizes of the burrs that you use will determine the various texture that you get. Now you can keep one texture really tight and one texture really loose if you want to, and various combinations within that. But once you set what the texture is for a given element at a given depth or distance from the viewer, you got to maintain that throughout the entire carving. So you might need to take notes, do sample blocks, and write down exactly what you did to help you remember as you go throughout texturing the project. One of the other things you might want to do when you get to the texturing stage is go ahead and ensure that every element that is the same, you've already determined what that is, and go ahead and texture each of those to match so that you get a uniform look throughout the carving.
Okay, so with a texture like this, there's a lot more variation. When I use just one size carbide and I make it as random and tight as possible, well, it's a very uniform look to it. But as you can see, this really pits it out in a different manner. And because I didn't go as deep as I do here, it really changes the look drastically, and I've used the same 2 burrs to do this. Now, I'm going to have some fun with these other 2 here and do something very similar along with that, varying the depth, varying the closeness or the compactness of each of the stipples, and to gain various textures. Now what you'll find is some textures might be very similar, but when it comes to detailing an entire scene, you're going to need different textures that are similar in order to change the way the look of the scene is, to differentiate some kinds of rocks from other kinds of rocks, or some kind of vegetation from other kinds of vegetation. All right, the sky's the limit here, but because we're not using color, because we're not using paint, we really need to focus on creating different yet similar textures that we can use in combination to achieve the looks and the separation of elements that we need. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and use the small carbide round, the number 9, and I'm going to go for it with this and see what we get. Alright, so with this texture, I started with the number 9 carbide round and I stippled it very close together, much like I would a standard stipple that you see in some of my videos. Now, the nice thing about doing that first was then I could come back with the number 10 carbide and smooth out sections. So basically, I established a depth that I was going with the number 9 carbide, alright, and I tried to maintain that depth throughout the entire piece. At that point, when I came back with the number 10 carbide, I went back to that depth. And I went over it until I achieved a smoothness that I wanted that still had the ripples and textures. Now, if you look at it and compare it, this looks completely different than this. Even though they're using the same things. Now, I've achieved two of these textures are similar and semi-close together. Now, with this one, I did not maintain a single depth, all right? So I have some deep areas, some smooth areas, but when I came back with the number 9 on the second pass, then putting in that changed the texture completely from establishing a smooth, uniform depth and texture with the number 9 and then coming back and breaking that up to that same depth. All right, so you're not only working with the size of the burr, you're also working with the closeness, the spacing of the burr, the randomness of the burr, the depth of the burr, and whether or not you keep the depth consistent or you change the depth radically, which is more along the lines of what this one is. However, I did go deep, pretty much similar in depth, but I went deeper on this one than I did these others, okay? So I got one more section. Let's go ahead and play with it here. Because I have the number 10 already into the handpiece, I'm going to go ahead and start with that.
In a lot of textures that you see or will see from me, random is really important. But also, to create distinction and difference between the elements of a carving, you can always go with very uniform, very linear, very organized textures to help provide a completely different set of looks to the elements that you're carving. Now, one of the nicest things about this is there's so many different combinations. You can go on the diagonal of the element that you are carving or in line with the direction that it's flowing. Based on the project and the element that you are carving, you doing something in a linear fashion can really help show direction, flow, and how it ties in to the elements around it.
All right, so let's say I stop right here and I don't do another size burr, okay? What I did with the number 10 carbide is I went back and forth, okay? Now, doing that, my depth was relatively the same across, okay? But not completely. All right, so there's a little bit of variation in the depth, but I basically went back and forth in rows and tried not to wiggle it or do anything like that. So it comes across line by line, okay, and filling that in. Now, if I were to stop right there, there's one texture. All right, and you can do it with any size carbide or diamond you want. Doing uniform or more stacked lines really does something, okay? This could be a honeycomb, it could be a tree bark that's fairly uniform, fairly smooth. What else could this look like? Perhaps like a lizard skin or a snake skin that is done. Now, just leaving it like that, there's a whole nother texture for you all by itself. And let's see what happens when I come back and I touch it up and I just play around with some randomization with the number 9 carbide. All right, so this is kind of like two designs or two textures in one, depending on how far you take it. Alright, so as I started carving this one, I decided, you know, let's not do random. Let's go ahead and go over all the ridges that I created by doing the lines of the number 10 carbide, alright? The deep areas, and then each row, there was a high spot on each row. And so what I ended up doing with the number 9 carbide was going over the top of each one of those rows. Now, looking at it, it's extremely uniform in a sense, because the grain texture runs in a specific direction, all right, and you can see that it's not random. It's not. It's very like there is a grain in this. Okay, the grain direction in this with the stipple. However, it's not highly pronounced like it was with the number 10 carbide, because when I went back and hit those ridges, now all of a sudden I've got a very still very uniform texture, because I went to the same depth that I went with the number 10 carbide, but going in the same lines kind of gives me a veining look to it, but it's still very, very interesting. Now, as you can see, with the same two burrs, okay, with this one I went very deep, I went very random, I went very spread out, okay, with that, and then each one of these looks completely different from the other, but at the same time they're very similar, and I've created 4 completely different effects using stippling methods with the number 10 carbide round and a number 9 carbide round. So this is just 4 little quick examples of what you can achieve with each of these burrs using a stippling method. All right. Now, this is just 4 examples. I'm going to cover a whole bunch more to give you at least a foundation that you can pull from and have some fun with, because one of the best parts about texturing is exploring, just trying new things and seeing what you can come up with. All right, there you have it. There's 4 different textures that you can create using 2 burrs of different sizes. They're even the same compound, all right? So there's lots of different things that we can do to create separation between the elements of our carving. So that's just one particular instance, one example of that. And just taking the time and pulling out a 2.5 by 2.5 inch block like I did here, just carve it just to get familiar with it, and just kind of store it in the back of your head. And then you can pull it out when you really need it, and you need to create various textures, and you'll be ready to go because you've already practiced it and you're familiar with what you want to accomplish. All right, so if that video helps you, go ahead and have fun with it. All right, if you want more of this, you can come on over to carvingonwood.com. I've also started an online school. It's just my way to help support the stuff that I'm putting out and help pay for doing all this stuff. So come on over, check out the online school. It's going to grow and I'm going to have a whole lot more content you'll see over the next few months. So keep that in the back of your head. You're welcome to come join the community and have some fun with us. And until next time, be safe, have fun, and enjoy all your power carving experiences. All right. Talk to you soon.